Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the 2021 Summer Wellness Series. Today, we are pleased to offer a panel discussion on diversity in mental health on post-secondary campuses, facilitated by Dr. Malinda Smith. Today's panelists are Dr. Bukola Salami, Dr. Gregor Wolbring, and Kome Odoko. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. The Summer Wellness Series is presented in partnership with the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning and the Campus Mental Health Strategy. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and published online to be viewed afterward. My name is Dr. Melissa Boyce, and I'm the Associate Dean, Undergraduate Programs and Student Affairs in the Faculty of Arts, as well as the Academic Coordinator of the Embedded Certificate in Mental Wellbeing and Resilience. And I'll be your moderator today. Please feel free to use the chat box during the session to ask questions. There will be time at the end for Q&A, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Please note that the chat box and your name display will be edited out of the final recording. All microphones and videos are turned off except for the facilitator and panelists to ensure your webinar experience is not disrupted with other video images or sounds. If you unmute and speak into your microphone, your voice will be recorded. At this time, I would like to introduce our facilitator, Dr. Malinda Smith. Dr. Smith is the University of Calgary's inaugural vice-provost, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. This means she's responsible for leading on issues of human rights, diversity, inclusion, and equity with stakeholders across campus and for driving UCalgary's institutional and community EDI goals. Dr. Smith has far too many accomplishments for me to list here, so let's just say that she serves on several committees and working groups, is a widely published author, an accomplished editor, and has won countless awards, including being named a 2021 Compelling Calgarian and a 2018 Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow. Welcome, Dr. Smith, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boyce, and thank you very much to all of you who have joined us today. This is, as Dr. Boyce points out, the second in the Summer Wellness series. The title of the series is Diversity in Mental Health and Post-Secondary Campuses. While our focus is shaped by the context and the moment, a pandemic, a moment of racial reckoning, the long shadow of the residential school's devastating and traumatic impact on children, families, and communities, among others. The causes that will be the issues that will be addressed in this session, the importance of mental health and well-being predate COVID and the pandemic. Still, we can talk about a pre-COVID, during COVID, and imagine what a more equitable post-pandemic moment might look like. What we can anticipate as is that the need for mental health supports and services will continue. The need for mental health and well-being and our attention to it will continue. So the session is entitled Diversity in Mental Health. COVID-19, as we know, has had a disproportionate impact on members of equity-deserving groups, women, visible racialized minorities, Indigenous peoples, lesbian, gay, bisexual, gender, transgender, queer, and two-spirit, and persons with disabilities. We also know as well that those who are religious and cultural minorities, the increase in Islamophobia, the increase in anti-Semitism, linguistic minorities, for example, if you're bilingual, speak an Indigenous language, if you're an immigrant or refugee and need supports and services, you've also experienced impact of COVID-19 and questions of access to these supports and services. But what all of these issues suggest to us is that we need to go beyond a generic or one-size-fits-all approach to mental health and well-being. We have assembled here today 3 stellar speakers who will speak to some aspects of the diversity and mental health. So what I'd like to do now is begin by introducing our first speaker very briefly. The full bios are in the chat, but our first speaker is Kome Odoko, who is a registered nurse and student support case management coordinator with the Student at Risk program at the University of Calgary Student Wellness Services. And Kome Odoko will be speaking on the topic of diversity and mental health on post-secondary campuses. I will introduce our second speakers, Dr. Bukola Salami and Dr. Gregor Wolbring in the moments ahead. So over to you, Kome Odoko.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, and to the rest of the team that have put together this amazing presentation, but just also to the staff and the students that make our work at Wellness Services run the way it does. So we really appreciate the partnerships that we've been able to build with all the faculties and staff that I know are represented today here at this presentation. So we can start with my first slide, if you would, Andrew. I appreciate that. So I wanted to just talk really briefly about the importance of diversity and recognizing diversity in our lived experiences. I think something that this pandemic 1.5 years has really taught us is that we're able to pivot to meet the needs of our students in a diverse way. So being able to move to online counseling supports has allowed us to reach students who may not have had the time in the past to be able to attend, whether it's because they're caring for a family member or working multiple jobs or just have challenges getting to and from our campus. And so being able to acknowledge those lived experiences for our students is really important. And the fact that that doesn't stop when they get to our campus. Those lived experiences, those identities, they bring them with them to the classroom, to our offices. And so being able to offer counseling supports or just mental health and supports in general that are far-reaching to the students, regardless of how they show up in front of us, I think is really important. Also noting the fact that we have a lot of identities, and I think in the last year, we've seen a number of social justice movements that don't stop just because you're a student. So acknowledging the fact that we've had students who are watching basically trauma on their social media timelines of racialized people being harmed and having to come to school and complete classes and take exams the same day, or people who are from spiritual backgrounds and engage in discrimination or receive discrimination and having to engage in their academic work as well. And so noting that we have to work as a community to recognize that everybody shows up quite differently and being able to provide supports that meet that. I think another part of that that's really important to talk about too is the diversification of our spectrum of support. So obviously we provide mental health support to our students on campus, but we also partner with other departments on campus, like the Faith and Spirituality Center, Leadership and Student Engagement, to meet the needs of students that we may not traditionally be able to support or who may not feel safe with us, which I think is a fair thing to acknowledge, that safety isn't always assumed, and we have to work to build safety and trust with certain populations and communities that we work with. And so I think also in talking about our support teams as well, recognizing that as we ask faculty and staff to support students and to support diversity in our students' mental health, we also need to be supporting our faculty and staff as well. And so that means partnering with staff wellness. That means talking about the fact that there are classes and departments and faculties that have quite a range of students' needs and supports. And so that extra support needs to be provided to them, regardless of if you're supporting a class of 10 students or 250. To be able to meet those diversity needs, we need to make sure that our faculty and staff are enabled and also supported in the work that they're doing, because their diversity needs are also important to be considered as well. And as a whole, I think our campus values really play a part in what we consider to be important to our well-being and our mental health. So looking at how we create a culture on our campus that says, I can make accommodations or changes to support your needs without having students feel uncomfortable or feel shame or guilt for seeking out those supports. We can build advocacy into the pieces of our community that it needs to be, and also look at how we implement those things as well. And so looking at things like asking for extra time for an exam, or needing to advocate for themselves. I think a lot of our students sometimes, the words to match the things that they're experiencing, sometimes they don't have those words, or those words don't exist in their cultures. And so being able to also empower students to verbalize and kind of speak to their experience, and know that it's safe to be able to say that in the way that it is really, really important, and how we sort of shift our community values. And I know that our campus mental health strategy, as well as our teaching and learning subcommittee, is working really hard on being able to bring those changes to our classroom to make space for our students. So we move to the next slide. So this is a diagram, or kind of a series of images really created by one of our nurses at Wellness Services while we were talking about this issue of diversity in mental health. And we were discussing a poem by Damien Barr. I know that people have probably heard this line before, probably in the last year, speaking to the fact that we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. So some of us have a little dinghy, some of us are in the sea, some of us have yachts. And I think that was a really good description of kind of the diversity needs that we see when it comes to mental health, is that we all have mental health, we all have well-being needs, but some of us have more supports than others. Some of us are able to articulate what kind of supports we need or know where to go. And so it's important for us as a community to recognize who needs extra help, who needs more support, and making those supports easily accessible as well. And knowing that not everyone's needs have to be met in the same way. So our team at Wellness Services is quite diverse. We have a team of student support advisors that do a variety of work with a variety of student needs, whether it's harm reduction or Indigenous support advisor or our neurodiversity advisor. I think it's important that we diversify the way that we supply mental health supports to students, because sometimes we're not the best fit. And that's okay. And I think it's important that we as a team come together and say, okay, if this isn't working for you, what other supports are there? Would you like to see a chaplain at Faith and Spirituality Center? Is there an advisor that you feel safe with? And coming together as a community to provide supports for our students. Because as mentioned earlier, I think our ability to diversify and to adapt, we've seen that we are incredibly capable of doing that. And so I'm looking forward to working with our team and other campus partners to work to build some of these things, the ideas that have been started in the past year, to really make sure that our students have great access to supports that we already provide. So thank you for that. I'll hand it over to Dr. Smith.
Thank you very much. So our second speaker is Dr. Bukola Salami, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Alberta, and who I had the privilege of working with prior to coming to the University of Calgary. Dr. Salami's research focuses on policies and practices shaping migrant health. She is a prolific author, scholar, and so the presentation today, the full bio is in the chat. The presentation today is focused on the mental health of Black youth in Alberta, one of the number of research projects she's been working on over the years. So Dr. Salami.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I will just go to the next slide. So I'll be presenting about the mental health of Black youth in Alberta. And we conducted the study right before the pandemic. From August 2019 to February 2020 was when we completed the study. And we interviewed 30 Black youths and also engaged in conversation cafe sessions with 100, no, actually 99 to be precise, Black youths in Alberta. So 129 Black youths participated in this study to find out about the factors that contribute to their mental health and also issues related to access to health services. Some of the factors the youths described would include racism and discrimination. And it's not just racism that they experience at the current moment, it's also racism that they've experienced as they were growing up, and how some of them have internalized those racism, and it continues to affect their mental health. So the first, the quote that I have, talking about how she grew up with internalized racism, and now she wanted, to have a a different skin color, different features. And this same youth also talked to us at some point later about how she was crossing the street once, and someone threw a sloppy at her and called her the N-word. And a lot of those experiences, she continues to internalize it. Academic expectation, almost all the youths that we interviewed, or a significant amount, were university students. So they discussed challenges in terms of, balancing the university, education, especially, when it's, September is always the best time of the year. But when it starts getting to exam time, that's a lot of stress. Openness about mental health. And the more they are able to talk to people about mental health, the better it is for their mental health. And a sense of community. And in another study, I looked at the Statistics Canada data to look at factors that contribute to mental health of immigrant population in Canada. And the two strongest factors that contribute to mental health of immigrant population in Canada were community belonging and income status. And the good thing about income, about community belonging, is it's so much amendable to social intervention. But at the same time, one of the challenges with community belonging is a sense of community. During COVID-19 and the physical distance measures, sense of community may be impacted by the physical distance measures during COVID-19. There's also issues related to spirituality and religion. Youth often talked about spirituality is always good for mental health. Religion, though, may be good, but also may for some youths talked about it wasn't the best for them. Next slide, please. We asked youths about barriers to mental health services, and many of the youths, as I said, were university students. They talked about cost of mental health services, especially counseling and psychological services. They talked about geographical barriers and distance from service location. For many that were at the university, they also talked about the openness of feeling like, is the space that you're going to receive mental health services, is it a white space, or is it open to diversity of individuals? The lack of Black demographic representation. So one you talked about, she would tell a counselor that I'm experiencing racism, and the counselor would be like, what? Oh, what? Are you sure? And then, okay, we'll just try and change the topic to something totally different, because the counselor, him or herself, is not comfortable or not knowledgeable on how to address racism issues or how to counsel people appropriately about racism, or have not had the lived experience. There's also lack of knowledge on mental health services. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There's stigma and judgmentalism, so the stigma of mental health, and also intergenerational gaps. So yes, youths are dealing with the school system, the educational system in terms of navigating mental health support, but they're also dealing with their parents too, and intergenerational gaps in terms of understanding of mental health and support for mental health. And many Black youths come into Canada from a collectivist culture, but they come into Canada to a culture that is really, really much more focused on independence. And this is not always the best for youth, for Black youth. So those are the points that I would identify for now. I think in the question and answer period, I may be able to shed more light on some of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salami. Our third speaker is Dr. Gregor Wolbring, who is a tenured full professor at the University of Calgary's Cummings School of Medicine in the program in Community Rehabilitation and Disability Studies. Dr. Wolbring's research focuses on ability studies, disability studies, and science and tech governance That's how he just self-identifies. I've had the privilege of knowing him for over, I don't know, what, 15 years, Dr. Wolbring. So it's my pleasure to have this first occasion to have a panel discussion with him at the University of Calgary. Dr. Wolbring.
Thank you, Malinda, and thank you for the organizers to having me and to set up this series. Next slide, please. Ability studies is in essence about how hierarchies and preferences come to pass of ability expectations and the impact of such hierarchies and preferences. Ableism was coined by the disability rights movement back in the 1960s and 70s. Can you go back again? What? Ableism was coined by the disability rights movement in the 1960s and 70s to call out the politics around ability expectations, and so often disabling use by powerful groups to push their ability privileges for the disadvantage of other groups. When we look at COVID, it's obvious that there was a total shift in ability expectations from people, by people, and so on. And then we look at the Employment Equity Act, which is just revamping now after 38 years. It says, no person shall be denied employment opportunities or benefits for reasons unrelated to ability. I can only hope that changes, because there's much more to ability than this phrase says, which means if it's about ability, I can actually deny employment. That's much more complicated, as I will show. Next slide, please. There are many concepts within ability studies one can show if they're not met, they decrease mental well-being. Ability security is one, which is having a decent life without one set of abilities. Reality is, employment-wise in the US, 36% of disabled people work, even before COVID. So in 2019, 84% of non-disabled people, showing that you are not having a decent life with your set of abilities, because if you're unemployed, right, that's obviously a problem. So we have ability insecurity, and that means your mental well-being will go down. Ability identity security is about that you're at ease with who you are with your set of abilities. There are many, many studies around disabled students which show that they are not at ease. They feel there's a stigma attached to disability as in not being ability normative, which impacts their desire to self-disclose, and that they even have to label themselves, identify and track within an institution so that they get their so-called accommodation, right? Is also seen as alienating and othering. And in the resource list, you will find many more articles on that. And this lack of self-disclosure willingness because of the stigma on not ability normative is, of course, also relating to faculty. Next slide, please. No. Right, you can see here the numbers of self-disclosure, 6.7, 7.1, 4.8, 10.44, at the non-student level. And when you look at the definition of disability with mental health and 10 different ones, obviously the numbers should be much higher. Right, next slide. If we are not experiencing ability, identity, security, and then we can assume you also experience ability-related abuse. And you see that here. 35% of disabled people, right, in the faculty, professorial, and so on level experience discrimination, and 47% harassment in 2019 in Canada. That can't be good for your mental well-being. And so, next one. And the last one is ability inequity, which is an unjust or unfair distribution of access to and protection from abilities generated through human interventions. Ability accommodation is not limited to disabled people, but everyone gets accommodation, but it's all the time seen as something special to disabled people, right? Or other groups we are marginalizing. It's all the time done for them, right? But in essence, your building code is about that the human body needs certain things. Washrooms, stairs. We need IT services because we have certain lack of levels of IT literacy among people, and so on and so on. To call out certain groups and say they need accommodation is, of course, really decreasing mental well-being, because they will be othered and seen as not cutting it. Next slide, please. And in COVID, of course, it changed all, right? We had a lot of people changing their own ability expectations. Others changed ability expectations with the help of them, from disabled people and the rest of society. For me, it was liberating COVID, as strange to say that as is, but moving stuff virtually allows me to, as a coping mechanism, to get rid of the social reality of physical inaccessibility in Calgary. That hasn't changed much in 30 years for me. And so the more I can do virtually, the better. Sometimes the accessibility can't be fixed well with our weather in the winter. What do you do in 30 centimeters of snow? Others is man-made or people-made, right? And so the question now will be, how will that change after COVID, right? Who will be, in essence, right? What will be the positives, the negatives, the neutral? What will be remain and for whom? And so in essence, what we have to ask ourselves, what will be the ability-based conflict, judgment, norms, privileges, insecurities, including identity insecurities and inequities be after COVID? And if that is not answered in a positive way of decreasing all of that, the mental well-being will go down. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wolbring, and thank you very much to our three speakers. What I'd like to do now is ask a couple of questions to the speakers, and then I'm going to turn the floor over, the virtual floor over to my colleague who will ask some questions of the audience. So one of the first questions I want to ask, point out, which I think is quite notable, is that all of you, all three speakers, spoke to questions that predate COVID-19. These are questions of stigma, questions of how we think about accessibility, inaccessibility, questions of how we think about accommodations or lack thereof. But fundamentally, we're talking about systemic and structural inequities. And these were, each of you are suggesting, based on research, based on experience, based on emerging research, including Stats Canada, that these intensified during COVID-19, which begs the question, how are we going to, how do we build back better, not just broadly speaking in terms of the economy, but more specifically in terms of the university? What needs to be done to ensure a more equitable environment for the university community, which will enable not mental health for students, staff, faculty, all who teach, research, live, and work on campus? So that's a big question. So you can take any slice of it that you like, but I actually think it's really important for us in this moment to have this kind of this discussion about how we might do things differently. So who wants to start? So we can start in the order of the speakers. So we can go, or we can start in reverse order and go with Gregor, then Bukola, and then Kome. How about that?
It's a really big question. I think first one, I think we have to increase, relating to my topic, the literacy. I don't think many people are even aware of the ability privileges they have. Right? When you, for example, a lot of the stuff people were really upset about the abilities they can't have during COVID is for disabled people a reality, or other groups, right? Or when we do like survey of people and we give them all kind of lists of abilities like washroom, handy, also I mean cell phone, electricity, food security, and so on and so on, you will find that most of these abilities are taken for granted by people who are not marginalized. And so calling it all out and say, well, this is actually what you can do because you're in a privileged position. So the term ability privilege is very important. And then if you want to keep that, then you have to make sure that inequity is then really dealt with for all people, I think is important. And I hope with COVID, where we saw that so many people saw, right, I assumed X, Y, Z, and now I can't do that, like visiting your neighbor. Well, as a wheelchair user, you can't, because they also have 3 steps in every house you built in Calgary outside, right, at the front door, and so on. So I think using this concept of ability allows you to really highlight what is not there and make it bigger, because the reality is not just about disabled people. Everyone experiences who is marginalized. Every EDI group experiences ability inequity, and so on.
Dr. Salami?
Thank you for the question. I think, of course, I've mentioned some issues related to racism and discrimination, including in access to services. So making sure that our mental health services actually have a diversity in terms of people that are providing services, and that people also feel welcome. Diverse people feel welcome into the space. I did mention that I did a study that looked at mental health of immigrants in Alberta, and that wasn't just focused on youth. And I interviewed after the analysis of 12,000 participants from the Canadian Health Measure Survey of Statistics Canada. I interviewed immigrant service providers in both Calgary and Edmonton, around 53 immigrant service providers, to find out, how can we actually address issues related to mental health. And one of the things they talked about is fostering a sense of community. And I think this is one thing that we have to be much more intentional about. Come August, September, when school return, is in what ways can we foster a sense of community among our students, especially given the fact that a lot of students have not been on campus for a year and a half now. Some students have been a student at the university for a year and a half, but they don't know any services that are available at the university. So we need to be much more intentional in increasing knowledge of students on not just mental health services that are available, because we know that there are diverse determinants that contribute to mental health, including income, for example. So how can we be more intentional in letting students know about that? And when I talked about to immigrant service providers, and I asked about sense of community belonging, one thing they stressed is creating natural environments. So creating a sense of community belonging is not just having, okay, now we are going to create a sense of community belonging, but in all programs and services that we deliver, all events that we deliver, actually intentionally infusing mechanisms to ensure that there's exchange and there's social aspect that promotes actually a social belonging. And I think also for our Black youths, there's a need for mentorship. There's also a need, when returning to campus, about flexibility too, because some youths are still, dealing, will still be dealing with some of the impact of COVID-19. So how can we be flexible in terms of accommodating diverse needs of individuals that come on campus? Thank you.
Thank you. Kome.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and a question that lots of folks are trying to actively answer. So some of my contributions to how we can further foster this on our campus kind of fall into 2 categories. The first being vulnerability. I think vulnerability in the way that allows us to say when we don't know things, or say when we may not be the best person for something. I think it's been mentioned that for some students anyway, this past year and a half has been probably one of the best of their academic career. And I think people sometimes feel uncomfortable saying that because they feel like maybe other people have had a really challenging year. But I think having vulnerability in our community means that we can acknowledge that our experiences are different from other people, and that there's value in that. And so I think for students, making space for that vulnerability, and obviously working in wellness services, students, we see a lot of students when they're vulnerable and they come to us and they share vulnerable things. And so being able to extend that practice into our community to say, we can share things without feeling fearful, without feeling shame, without feeling guilt. But I also think it's important to lean into the community that we already have. So if there are supports that are available in the community that aren't present on our campus, how can we bring them in? How can we say, how do we partner with you to make sure that your community on our campus is safe and supported as well? So that might be, paying for an elder to come in and offer services, or looking at how we can better, foster maybe Black youth in terms of their artistic support, or look at other communities that maybe are not at the forefront. I know especially in the past year, there are communities that have been pushed to the front, but are there other communities that we could be better supporting on our campus in more effective ways? I think stepping out of our comfort zone, being able to acknowledge when we don't get things right, and then being more vulnerable. No one wants to be called out. I think we can do a calling in when things aren't the best or things need to change. But I think all that vulnerability helps us to be better community members to ourselves.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for those comments. I have another question, which relates to something I haven't heard a lot of discussion about, broadly speaking. So everyone has been impacted by COVID-19. That means whether you are in senior administration, and Kome, I love your boat metaphor, because this is actually very the dinghy or the yacht. Which one might more likely to capsize? That's actually a really interesting metaphor. But everyone's been impacted. And here I'm thinking in particular that the analogy to the frontline worker who's taking the bus to go to work, or who's more the racialized communities that are more likely to get COVID-19, or the members of LGBT communities who are more likely to be traumatized by having to return home rather than the freedom that the campus provided. But so have professors been impacted by COVID-19. So have the teaching assistants been impacted, the postdoc, the graduate students, the undergraduate students, the communities around, the community service supports, people who are providing food, who haven't been able to be on campus, or coffee shops. So this is a community-wide concern, yet we often talk about faculties being more accommodating or staff being more accommodating. What do we need to do to think about this, to think about the community aspect of this, and what it means to be a community of support for all members of the university community, as well as the broader community? Because I actually think if we don't give more attention to the ways in which everyone's impacted, we're going to be missing some really serious challenges in the classrooms, in the research ecosystems, on campus generally. So anyone want to take this question? It's also a big question, but one that I do not think I've seen enough attention to, which is to say, all of us have been impacted by COVID-19, and the return to campus might present particular kinds of issues for different members of the community, roles, but also equity deserving groups. So perhaps we'll start the other way around and go with Kome, since you are actually in the midst of these kinds of conversations. Then we will go to Dr. Salami and then Dr. Wolbring.
Thank you. And I think just before I start, just a huge shout out to the staff wellness team and all that they do to support that teams. I think that's incredible and necessary work. But I think similar to what we talk about when we talk about students, the diversity piece of the kind of needs that we have. Something that I've learned over the last year and a half is sometimes the challenges of our team members who have kids at home, and some of the things and challenges they have to put in place to be able to successfully complete their work requirements, and even thinking about returning to the office too, looking at that maybe their kids aren't able to get vaccinated if they're choosing to do values on how we shift our teams and how they work to make sure that everybody feels comfortable to do the work that they love, or to seek that support actively to make sure that we're reaching out to them to say, okay, how do we make this work for you? I think not placing the burden on the marginalized person or the person who maybe doesn't have as much access is really, really important, and kind of taking that step, which I think we've seen over the last few months as we kind of plot our return back to campus, but also just, I think, making space for the anxiety that comes with going back to campus and not really knowing what's happening. I think acknowledging that a lot of people are scared and don't really know how this is going to work or how long it's going to last, and making space for that and validating that experience, I think, is really, really important, because we want people to feel like they're being heard. We want them to be heard, don't even feel like they're being heard. We want them to be heard in the decisions that we're making, and being able to feel confident and comfortable going to maybe their manager or their, the director and saying, hey, this is where I'm at. These are the things that I'm juggling in my hands. How can we make this work for us? I think those are some of the suggestions that I would offer.
Thank you. Dr. Salami or Dr. Wolbring?
I agree with what has already been said in terms of, I think, the COVID-19 pandemic, especially for female academics, really, really brought on the impact of gendered care work, and especially whenever there's a school closure. And I think for a lot of academics too, it's also brought increased burden, from having to switch to online delivery, and now having to actually put more work into switching back into something that you've not done in the past 1.5 years. And I think that, and also changes in work process. There's been a lot of changes in work process over the last 1.5 years in terms of how things are processed, even within universities. And I think, as you said, for a lot of academics, just thinking about the fact that there was a transition and now you have to transition back, it may bring on a lot of anxiety for many of our colleagues. And I think knowing the resources that are out there, and Kome may be much more available, able to shed light on some of the resources that are specifically at the University of Calgary. And also, I think it's also very, very important to see this as a transitioning process. And I mean, the way that I plan to do this for myself is, over a 2-week period or 3-week period, sort of, have a plan in terms of how I would slowly transition back into the university. So maybe it's, in the first week I come 2 days, and then in the next week I kind of increase it as time goes. So as I said, and I think also for many of us too, it's, we've not been feeling connected anymore to our colleagues on campus. So all our colleagues now, everyone is doing their thing, and we don't really know, I mean, that sense of community. And I think, it's really, how do we foster that sense of community? Again, when people come back on campus and when our colleagues come back on campus. Thank you.
Gregor?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of it. I mean, from my point of view, I think there's an opportunity to use that ability studies lens to really, dismantle, the negative politics of how you use them, right? I mean, they're often used to justify isms, right? The suffragette movement, man decided rationality as an ability is important, and then man decided women are not rational. And then women could not vote or own property and so on. And I think we can use the COVID situation and what comes afterwards to really dismantle a lot of the problems around abilities and to map it out. In the moment, we're all in silos, right? I mean, we're talking about that group or that group or that group. And we really don't have good framework to talk about all of them, that they're all in the same boat. And I coined disability studies one because I felt disability studies is ghettoized, right? This impacts disabled people, no one else, right? And I felt, well, this ability stuff which impacts disabled people impacts everyone, because powerful groups set certain ability standards which suits them, right? And I think to map it out, and this will not be, I mean, a short-term thing. I mean, technology, artificial intelligence, automatization, like the self-driving truck. What does a trucker do, right? Is it, I mean, they can't all become IT specialists, right? So which skills you will get a job down the road and so on. Disabilities everywhere. And if we use it as a lens to bring us all together into, we are all in the same boat and decrease silos, I think then we are on a good way.
Thank you very much. So I want to just check in with my colleague, Dr. Melissa Boyce, to see if there are questions in the chat before we, if otherwise I can continue.
I would say that if you do have another question, to feel free to continue. We've had 2 questions come up as direct messages to me that I can pose after.
Oh, no, you can go ahead and then I can come back to my questions. Let's get the audience questions.
Okay, perfect. And so so the first question was for Kome, and when you spoke initially, you talked about the importance of providing extra supports, and whether you might be able to specify any specific examples of what types of supports would be helpful to include in the teaching and learning context.
Okay, and so I think looking at that in terms of wellness supports, I think knowing about programs like the Student at Risk program, which is a reporting mechanism for folks to seek supports for students that they're concerned about on our campus, and we're able to provide outreach and supports, but also knowing that within that you have the opportunity to consult and say, hey, I have a student that maybe I haven't seen in a couple of classes, I'm not sure what's going on for them, I'm not really sure how to support them, and to be able to talk that out with our team, and myself or our other team members, and say, how do we figure that out? But also to say, how are you doing in this class of maybe 80 students? You may have a number of students in that class that are, experiencing some mental health challenges or other challenges, to be honest, and help you better navigate that while also looking at your well-being, knowing that those are available supports and channels for you as well, knowing that there are supports within our services, not only just counseling, but there's peer support, there are groups that your students can attend, and you can be a part. And when we talk about you supporting or being a support person, we like to highlight that it's a spectrum. So folks have the opportunity to engage in whichever way they feel most comfortable. So you may be most comfortable just connecting them with us for a conversation, or you may be more comfortable kind of walking them over when we resume in-person services. And so you figuring out where you land on that spectrum before classes start could be a really great service for you as well, or support for you. Just knowing, feel like, what is my wellness plan, not only for myself, but for my students as well. I talk about the fact that we can't have healthy students without healthy staff and faculty. And so just those sorts of supports, whether it's going to some of our workshops or chatting with, I know the TI has a lot of how you add mental health into your class curriculum strategies that are really helpful, whether it's breaks or how you allocate marks. So just kind of looking into those sort of resources, and I'd be happy to chat or send a note if you wanted to learn more about that, or maybe I can send it to one of the team here and they can forward that out as well. I hope that answered the question.
I think that was a great answer. I'll open it up to Bukola and Gregor as well, if you might have anything else you'd like to add. No? Or yes.
Can you repeat the question, please?
It was looking at extra supports that could be employed, and the question specifically related to the teaching and learning context, but to support students with diverse needs as we come back to the classroom.
I think, in terms of Kome answered it well in terms of looking at what other support, but I think it's also very, very important to think about, how can we, not just focusing on mental health, but we know that there's diverse other determinants that influence mental health. So we know that racialized individuals are differentially impacted by issues related to income. So how do we support students with that aspect? We also know, for example, I don't know if University of Calgary has a center for LGBTQ2+, or has support services specifically for people with disabilities. And I think it's drawing on those other supports so that then, we address things from our early intervention stage rather than when things have really gone bad and do need intense mental health support.
Thanks, Dr. Salami. Dr. Wolbring?
Well, given what I showed, that disabled students, for example, feel rather having problems with that they have to self-identify as defective products in order to get accommodation. I do that on, right, accommodation. There is some initiatives in New Zealand, even before COVID, to change how we do assignments, that you don't have to self-disclose. You put them in that with a variety of abilities, you simply can do the assignment, right? That you don't have this thing that you have to define yourself as an defective product in order then to, which is definitely constantly talked about in the literature around disabled students. And so, right, to reboot now that we say we can do things in a variety of ways, right? How we do teaching, how we do, and that is also for the faculty. I do mostly virtual, by now actually totally virtual, because I haven't found one classroom at the UFC yet who is wheelchair accessible, right? All the podiums I can't use because they expect a certain height so that you can actually see the screen. Right, but it's totally unreasonable for that one wheelchair user, right, to change all the podiums, and we just don't have many wheelchair lecturers, right? So for me, the virtual is the solution, right, which is much more tenable than change all the podiums. And so I think we have to find a way to do things in a more diverse way. And COVID showed that certain things where people said before that is not possible, it is possible. And so we have to see where that goes, because reality is the world is changing after COVID. The job market is changing. Everything is changing. And so we have to be, simply more diverse in our solutions so that people can be, right, and be flexible and for the reality of the world.
Thank you, Dr. Wolbring. That's really great. There have been a couple questions. I'm going to go out of order because I want to continue the same theme. And so I'm not skipping a question. I'll come back to it. But there was a follow-up question from Kome's mention that safety should not be assumed in offering mental health supports to equity-deserving groups. What are some strategies, policies, et cetera, to build this necessary sense of safety and trust?
I think just kind of acknowledging sort of our parts in that process. But I see that maybe my other panelists might want to speak. So maybe I'll let Dr. Salami go first and then I'll follow up.
So I think, in terms of safety, I think, one of the things is addressing, the intersectional issues that individuals experience. So we know that during the COVID-19 pandemic, that there's been a higher increase in attacks against religious minorities, especially Black women who are Muslim. So, of course, there's all challenges, issues related to safety. And we also know that racialized individuals have had some bad experiences within the system in the past. And now do we address some of the issues that they have experienced related to racism? And, one of the things that I have always advocated is a lot of times we do presentations, educational sessions about discrimination, about racism, about anti-racism, but we never actually consider it as part of our evaluation or part of a competency that we need to have. So for example, I talked about the quote that I gave about someone that goes to a counselor and says, I'm experiencing racism. And the counselor just wants to brush it off and move to something else. Of course, that shows that the counselor is actually not competent enough to be able to address issues related to racism and discrimination. And I think for us to ensure that everyone feels safe, that it's not just counselors, also university professors and also students alike need to really, really be grounded in how to ensure that they're anti-racist And also how to ensure that they also have a perspective that considers the intersectional influences that COVID-19 pandemic has had of people of diverse social classes and also social locations.
Thank you, Dr. Salami. Dr. Wolbring, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I mean, as to safety, obviously, it's a big issue, and it's not just quite often disabled people, whether disabled women or Black disabled people and so on. They are normally not part of the debate because it's like they're falling under the bigger issue of then safety of women or race and so on. But when you look at that table I showed for just the faculty and instructors, I don't think if they are like 47% who feel that they're harassed, that can't be, I mean, a very safe environment. And we have to really unmap all of that. Where does it come from? Because you can't, this is just a number, but we have no really context, right? What that actually is, what is falling under that microaggression. Of course, they are all the EDI groups experiencing microaggression, right? And will it be worse with a more polarized society, right? With, I mean, motivated reasonings where people only watch the information which suits them and so on, right? There are a lot of dynamics going on which have nothing with university, which will spill into the university and will make it really a challenge to have a safe, diverse, and so on, I mean, climate.
Thank you. Thank you. The question that I had jumped over to continue this theme, I'm gonna return to, and it's a big question. And so in terms of changing the system, do you prefer abolition or reform to make the system more equitable and just to racialize / marginalized communities? And so I will open it up to any of the panelists who wish to begin.
Maybe I can start this one.
I appreciate that.
Because if it's inequities, generally speaking, in the academy, do we want to abolition? Is that the university, the institution, or reform the institution? This is a ongoing question about how do you affect change, but also how do you affect change that's not just tokenistic or that's on the margins that actually seems superficial, but actually how do you ensure change that's systemic and structural? So that's a big question. And in many ways, the conversation we are having about mental health actually suggests these issues are bigger and require much more institutional discussion about climate, about culture, about how we structure conversations, about how we even think about the work that we do. So some of the questions around who actually wants to come to campus or who actually can thrive virtually versus in person. So for example, Dr. Wolbring's question about thriving in the virtual environment. There are some racialized people who can turn off their cameras, who thrive in the virtualized because they don't have to deal with face-to-face racism or those kinds of barriers. There's some LGBTQ or trans who prefer not to be in the face-to-face environment. All of these to me are questions about the need for systemic structural change. And right now we are dealing with them in terms of mental health supports, but I actually think they are actually more about the larger creating an equitable academy, which values and respects, and I don't use those words superficially, the diversity of people who teach, research, and work and live on campuses. And right now, this isn't about just wellness, people who are dealing with wellness, or people who are dealing with teaching and learning. It's actually about our very governance and leadership structures, and whether people appreciate that these issues matter to even how we think about the university. What is a university? About the content of what we deliver, but also how we deliver it, about who delivers it and their experiences. So I mean, I'm hoping these conversations that we're having today invites us to think more broadly about what an equitable academy requires and how we go about producing that. Because tinkering on the margins or reform that doesn't think about these kinds of questions we're discussing as long-term, they're not going to end post return to the campus. Some of the impacts of COVID-19 are going to be intergenerational. So we actually need to be thinking much bigger and deeper, which means engaging with a diversity of people, equity deserving groups who need to be sitting at the table having these conversations. And right now, my concern is, in fact, these conversations are happening on the side while everything else proceeds business as usual. And that actually, to me, does not lead to it doesn't even lead to reform. It just leads to tinkering. And so that's a very good question, I think, for a larger discussion about what an equitable academy looks like. And that's a question that includes discussions about mental well-being, physical well-being, accessible campuses, inclusive campus. And when I say accessible, I mean income, because Dr. Salami raised the question of income as well. But that to me is something we definitely need more discussions about. I mean, I'll let others, I mean, maybe Dr. Salami would say something else about smashing the system, abolishing the system, but I actually think we need systemic structural change. And right now, that's often not the conversation we are having.
Yeah, I would like to add that, oh, sorry, you want?
Oh, you can go ahead, sorry.
And of course, we are only as good as, I mean, the system we are in as a university, right? So Alberta, right, also has to improve, right? Or Canada, I mean, right, we are not by ourselves. And we are only as good as the students already, I mean, getting certain knowledge within high school or junior high school, elementary school, right? If they're already fabbed in certain ways, I mean, right, and they're coming here already with a lot of preconceived ideas which are in certain direction, which are not EDI related, that of course has an impact, right? And I also think we have to, when it's about, I mean, ability security, it can't be just all university. We have to also cherish the blue collar worker. It can't be that it's all about university people and they are, I mean, they are getting cherished and then the blue collar worker doesn't. Right, so it's, I mean, so it's really, I mean, a societal question, all of this, where we are going and where we are moving. And it has to be really about cherishing people's ability differences, everyone. If we don't cherish the plumber, which by the way, I'm really bad in plumbing, right? I mean, there's a problem. It's not just about the students who, I mean, make it to our university system. I mean, and all of that feeds and back also, it becomes a better university if it becomes a better Alberta, a better Canada, and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Wolbring. Dr. Salami?
Well, I think there is definitely a need in terms of, disrupting some of the structures and some of the processes that we have in place. And I think COVID-19 has actually helped us with some of that. To actually disrupt some of our structures and processes. And I think the question that we have now is, do we go back to the same process, or do we actually see what opportunities exist based on the experiences we've had over the last 1 year to kind of think much more forward in terms of how to address inequities that people face. And I agree with Dr. Smith about the need to actually go beyond the tokenistic representation, or also a tokenistic policy framework. And it's not the time now to start thinking, not to be racist on campus, but actually to think more about how to be anti-racist. And when I look at a lot of equity, diversity, and inclusion policies and initiatives across Canada, the trend I've always seen is it's all often like we take 2 steps forward, and then there's always an opposing force that actually gets us 1 step backwards. So if we always just think, okay, we need to take 1 step forward, then that's really not moving at all, because there is an opposing force to it. And that's why we need to actually think much more aggressively in terms of how we address and issues related to equity, diversity, and inclusion on campus.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really great insight. A really interesting question has come up as a direct message. And so the question is, I've been learning more about policing and mental health, and I'm wondering if the panel has any thoughts on academic probation in terms of what has been discussed today, knowing that marginalized groups are more likely to have compromised mental health and therefore grades will suffer. The language of these policing mirrors language in policing, and I'm wondering if there are opportunities to move from policing performance to creating communities of care. And I will, Kome has had some technical issues, and so she's trying to log back in. So I'm going to turn it over to, let's go to Dr. Salami first.
I think that's an interesting perspective, and I know when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, that institutions were thinking how to actually deal with issues related to assigning grades and marks, and I think that issue that has been raised is something that institutions have to think more about, especially related to marginalized population, and also people that may have had, because we must recognize that COVID-19 pandemic has also had differential impact on different individuals of diverse, that, for example, Black populations. I think there's a study that just came out just this week or last week in Manitoba that shows that some groups are 20 times more likely to have COVID-19 than white populations, some ethnic groups. And that's a huge impact. So a lot of the academic outcomes of some of our students may be impacted by a lot of the other things that are surrounding them in their lives. And I think it's an important consideration to consider the context in which students are working, and in which and to ensure that they have opportunities to thrive. But I think, yes, the issue about policing is on campus, and issues related to grades is something that should be of more of a broader discussion within academic institutions.
Thank you, Dr. Salami. I don't know if Kome is back yet. So Dr. Wolbring, do you have anything you'd like to add to this topic?
Not much around the policing, besides that when you look at it, I mean, disabled people are also impacted by it. But I think one nice academic concept is the one of life admin, right? And different groups are impacted, have to do more life admin based on their reality, right? Like part of it is discrimination admin and so on. It's the same if you're a single mom or and so on. That everyone has certain life admin, and the more privileged you are, the less you have to deal with it. Right? I think that's a good concept to look at more holistically, also of the life of the people outside of the university, because the students are, of course, impacted by how they experience the life outside of their university, right? And so on. With police, I just don't have much, experience, so I really can't say much there.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think, Kome, I believe you may be back. The question was related to the language that is used around university policies, particularly when it comes to academic probation. But I'd also actually introduce misconduct, academic misconduct in there as well, and how potentially there might be opportunities, or if there's there could be any opportunities about addressing this. And Kome, if you are here and can have an audio connection, would you have anything you'd like to add?
I think I can add a little bit. I'm not an expert in that particular area, but I think a perspective that can be maybe improved on in terms of the language that we use is maybe looking at how we adopt language to kind of meet the literacy needs of the students that we have. So do students actually understand what things like plagiarism means, and what, like, I know with a lot of our international students, that's one of the services, a workshop that's offered by International Student Services, is kind of really an introduction or an explanation of what academic integrity is and plagiarism is, and being able to further develop, I think, students' understanding of what some of these academic policies mean, not just for their academic record or performance, but making sure they really have an understanding of what the language is, and maybe looking at how we can adapt that language to be more accessible for students. But that's kind of the only thoughts that I would have at this time on that topic.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We don't have any outstanding questions right now in the chat. We have 3 minutes left, so there might be time for one final question if there are any. And so this would be your opportunity to pose it. If you have it, I'll give a few seconds. So.
I'm sorry. I did post a question. Would I be able to ask the panel?
Yes. Oh, my apologies. You got mixed in the mix.
Oh, no worries. No worries. And I don't know, it might be a tough question, so it might be easier for me to say it if that's okay. So I work in testing specifically in Edmonton at a local college there. And we find that students with disabilities or students that are in minorities I personally feel like they're disadvantaged when it comes to our admissions testing. There's a lot of barriers there, and I just especially when it comes to digital literacy as well. I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts around that, like admissions testing and how to make things more equitable.
It's a great question. I'll open it up to the panel if there are any thoughts on this topic.
I can go ahead with this one actually too, because it is about how do we ensure equity in admissions, student admissions, and whether some mechanisms. So some institutions have, Black admissions, they have Indigenous admissions, they have diversity admissions, they have different kinds of tests. Some are multiple guests, some are written, and the question always with these, including at the graduate level, is whether they are culturally specific kinds of questions, and therefore by virtue of being culturally specific, or they actually rule people out. Others, for example, some of the diversity admissions require people to disclose information which may induce trauma. So there is a conversation about how we ensure the pathways into the university equitable, but also don't induce a certain kind of trauma inducing for students who are having to apply using these. But rather than the one size fits all, I would call it an equitable pathways, which is to recognize differences in the process. So I think that's actually a good question of whether the test itself is a barrier to admissions, rather than actually creating any kind of standard that's worthy of keeping. And so it's also worth thinking about who is most likely to be disadvantaged by certain tests, and whether that's reproducing homogeneity and the sameness rather than being a mark of excellence, for example, as is probably sometimes projected. So I think that's a good question. I'll turn it over to Bukola or Gregor if they have any additional questions, any additional responses.
None by me.
I agree with what Dr. Smith has already said in terms of testing, because one of the challenges with some tests is also the cultural appropriateness of things in the test, and there is also issues related to accessibility, including so for example, we know that for some youths, being able to have the same amount of resources to actually study for a test may be differentially impacted. So I agree with what Dr. Smith has said.
Thank you very much. That actually brings us to the end of the session. And so Thank you for attending the second session of the 2021 Summer Wellness Series. On behalf of the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning and the Campus Mental Health Strategy, I want to thank all of the participants who joined us today. And a big thank you to Dr. Smith for facilitating such a wonderful discussion. And of course, thank you to our panelists, Kome Odoko, Bukola Salami, and Gregor Wolbring. The recorded video of this session will be available on the Taylor Institute website within a week or two. There's still one more webinar in the Summer Wellness Series on August 19th that will be facilitated by Dr. Keith Dobson. Visit the Taylor Institute's website to register. Thank you for joining us today and have a great afternoon.